Ooh.
Ready to talk about some fights?
Oh, am I? Am I ready?
So this card is full of good ass scraps. Like this, none of them are especially high profile or like that kind of existentially interesting, but it's full of good ass fights.
Yeah, it is. It's a UFC card. It's I guess they should subtitle this one UFC. Hey, at least it's not Arlovsky Struve. Since that was like until 3 weeks ago, all they had to offer us. Yeah, I agree with you. Like, there's a lot of sneaky, awesome fights here, but
yeah, I mean, is it gonna be a card that I remember this time next year? Absolutely not. I will have, honest to God, I will have forgotten about this card. Up until like pretty much after we're done talking about it on Monday, I will forget about it until I have to pull up these videos to watch them for the next time these people fight.
Oh, I experience that so frequently now. I just watched Andre Sukumtat knock out Luke Sanders.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that happened.
Yep, and it was only as I watched the knockout combination that I remembered I saw it when it happened.
Yeah, same here. And I'm like, I should know that because I was just I rewatched Wonder Woman and I went to see that with Luke Sanders, so he popped into my head, and then I was like, well, what happened to him? Like, what was his last fight? Completely forgot about it until I watched this for this.
Jesus, I don't consider me forgetting any kind of personal betrayal, but let's hope this doesn't make it into the episode and that Luke Sanders doesn't hear it.
You should absolutely put this in the episode. That's just one of the more random things that's ever happened to me. Like, I ate tacos with Jason High one time, and I saw Wonder Woman with Luke Sanders.
That's what the UFC does to your brain.
Renders you unable to think of people as, like, fully formed human beings.
Yeah, I was more going for, like, the incapable of storing memories anymore angle, but definitely the dehumanization of your personal relationships is a big part of being in the MMA media. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Heavy Hands. I'm your host, Connor Ruebusch. You may be able to tell I'm slightly sick this week. I apologize for the disturbing nasal quality that my voice will have throughout this episode, but fortunately the dulcet tones of Dr. Patrick Wyman are here to soothe your ears. Patrick, give them a little something of what they came for.
Yeah, no, I too am a little bit sick, but I'm always a little bit sick because I have a toddler who's just a germ factory. So, yeah, there's always a rattle in my lungs or something going on here because it's just germs everywhere. Yeah,
I was not expecting the the death rattle. Honestly, I wasn't.
Should have. I was planning that.
Oh, perfect.
I was saving that cough. As soon as you started talking about dulcet tones, I'm like, oh, this motherfucker.
Perfect timing. Perfect. Well, what are we here to discuss today, Pat? We got UFC 222 ahead of us, and that is going to be taking up most of the ledger for today's episode. We are going to preview the main event, which of course is another slightly pointless women's featherweight title fight. The UFC is determined to continue feeding Cyborg challengers without actually building any kind of division around her. And to that end, Kunitskaya is fighting Cyborg, another bantamweight coming up in weight, a solid fighter, but we will talk a little more about that in a moment. Then we're going to cover the co-main event, what I think Pat and I both think is probably the most compelling matchup, the more compelling of the two top build matchups here. The featherweight interim title fight, is it? Is it still a title fight?
No, I don't think it's a title fight. I think it's just 3 rounds now.
All right, so a 3-rounder. God only knows what's happening. A 3-rounder between Frankie Edgar and Brian Ortega. There's a couple other fights in this card that we are going to get to as well before, at the end of this episode, recapping some of our favorite moments from last week's UFC on Fox, Emmett versus Stevens, which, like the card before it, and the card before that, despite having very little existential significance, was certainly fun to watch and had a lot of crazy action moments. And so we'll get to that at the end of today's show. Without further ado, though, let's dive in on the main event. Cyborg versus Kunitskaya. I think the subtitle for this card should be, in light of the dynamics of the main event, UFC 222. Remember the Holly Holm fight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Well, I mean, charitably, Cyborg's biggest battle here is probably going to be against the scale on Friday. Will she be able to make the weight, especially on relatively short notice here? That, I think, is going to be the major challenge. If she can, and that actually adds an interesting dimension to this, because Kunitskaya is tough. She's durable. She can take a good shot. She could be able to stick around into the later rounds. She has been training. She was scheduled to fight this last week, if memory serves. I think she was scheduled to be on that Emmett Stevens card in Orlando. So she's had a full camp. She's prepped. She should have a full gas tank. Will Cyborg? Cyborg is never out of shape, but she does a lot of road work. She is an extremely well conditioned fighter, and more than anything else, she does a good job of staying calm and not blowing through her gas tank in a short period of time. So, but still, not having been in fight camp, not having been cutting weight for many weeks, it usually takes her a long time to get down to 145 for these things. Those are kind of X factors that toss a little wrench in here. Will they probably matter? No, probably not, but it's worth noting them. So, Connor, I mean, what's your read on Kunitskaya? What does she have to offer here?
Well, there's a reason I make that Holly Holm comparison, and it's not just the fact that Kunitskaya, like Holm, likes to ki with every strike. I think she does have a lot in common with Holly Holm, with some notable differences. And by the way, I should mention before we move on, kind of without me noticing, the day of the 8-week camp seems to have passed us by. Is that kind of weird? That didn't notice a turning point of any kind, but it's like more and more on UFC broadcasts, I'm hearing commentators talk about how somebody accepted a fight 3 weeks before the date, and so on and so forth. Is this just the new model for matchmaking, that we just scramble to put cards together at the last minute, and we have to set the date, and so people don't get 8 weeks to prepare for their fights anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the reason why we're hearing so much more about weight cutting troubles is because there's so many more fights being put together 5, 6, 7 weeks out, 8 weeks, or even if you put a fight together 8 weeks out, you don't necessarily start your camp the day you sign for a fight. I think that fighters used to have more time to get these things together and start thinking about their diet. I think they could plan a little better. I think there's more pressure on fighters to take fights, kind of paradoxically, or on the kinds of fighters who are missing weight. I think there's more pressure on them to take fights. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but yeah, I think alternatively, when you get a main event booked a long ways out, I think you see guys doing even longer camps than 8 weeks. I think you see guys are starting to do like 12-week camps now.
We get cancellations, so it's either you have a 3-week camp and the fight that you were initially scheduled for happens, or it doesn't because of weight issues or whatever else, and then you have a 3-month-long camp.
Yeah. This could just be confirmation bias from us because there are so many more fights now.
Yeah, very true. Good point.
But it's entirely possible. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're fine. I interrupted myself, as I so often do. It's worth thinking about, though, as you pointed out, because Cyborg, of course, notably turned down. I can't remember what the fight was, but she did turn down a fight offer because it was like 6 weeks, and she said she would not have enough time to get the weight off. So it's worth considering that she may be affected by a weight cut, and we don't know what her conditioning was like, what kind of work she was doing, but this fight was made like February, maybe the first week of February. So, not a ton of time to prepare. I think that is worth thinking about, especially with the similarities between somebody like Kunitskaya and Holm. I was talking about the key differences between them. The ki is obviously similar. The willingness to stifle against the cage or work from long range and doing very little in between is also similar. Kunitskaya, I think, is a lot more authoritative than Holly Holm at actually bridging the gap with her strikes, actually bringing her attacks to her opponent. even with like the linear kicks, the ones that you don't think of typically as real damaging strikes, there is a big difference between the way Kunitskaya's teep lands and penetrates the torso of her opponents and Holly Holm's sidekick, which so frequently just kind of seems to bounce off without having an effect. And likewise, Kunitskaya's got a great jab. When she comes forward and drives that jab home, she has a good effect. But it's sort of she's sort of a reverse Holly Holm in that respect, because I think she lacks some of the potency and timing that made Holly Holm so difficult for Cyborg, that allowed Holly to really trouble Cyborg and counter her counters from time to time and draw her into shots. I think Kunitskaya falls apart a little bit more than Holly Holm when she's pressured, and doesn't seem to... She strikes me as a very offensively focused fighter. And I think a lot of what she does, whether she's on the ground, even her takedown, sometimes her wrestling and grappling look pretty good, and it's when she's attacking. And likewise with her strikes. And then the moment she's put on the defensive, she's not quite always adjusting fast enough or treating the threats coming at her with enough respect to, to have the kind of effect that Holly Holm had. So I think that's going to be pretty important in this fight, because that ability to counterpunch Cyborg was a big part of what allowed Holm to stick around for 5 rounds and trouble Cyborg until like the last 2.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you to an extent. I think that Kunitskaya is much more comfortable than Holm moving forward. That I think Kunitskaya, given a choice, would prefer to be not like all out pressuring, but she likes to dictate she likes to hold the initiative.
Yes.
She likes to, I think, given her choice, she would like to be either in the center of the cage or pushing you back. I don't think she likes to be off her back foot, whereas I think Holm is perfectly content to be working off her back foot, which not always to her benefit.
For sure.
The Kunitskaya, yeah, and I think you're right to point to the idea. She's more damaging with her shots. She turns her hip over really nicely. She's got pretty good fundamentals in terms of how she throws her strikes. Really nice 1-2 that she throws straight down the pipe.
Very snappy.
Nice linear. Yeah, she's got snappy. That's a good way of putting it. She's got really good snap to her punches. With that said, she is unbelievably vulnerable to the counter because her head just stays right on that line as she throws and after she throws. She's good at getting out of the way after she throws. So she'll throw a 1-2, get back to her stance, and then move, right? But in that point, between the time when her punch leaves her guard and comes back to her, and in the split second after her hands return to her guard, or she pulls her kick back, she is just open to being hit with practically any counter that you throw because she's right there on the center line. And because she's just thrown at you, you know exactly what the distance is. So basically, every single time in her last fight that Raquel Paolui tried to counter her, she was able to do it. Now, that is just a god-awful recipe against a counterpuncher of Cyborg's caliber, who's one of the best counterpunchers in MMA in terms of her ability to read what's coming, to put together more than one shot, to mix up the location and type of counters, her ability to adjust the arc of a shot as she throws it to kind of loop around or through your guard. Like, she is just going to fucking crush Kunitskaya with some of those counter shots. Like, if Raquel Paolui can counter you, Cyborg is going to do terrible things.
No doubt. And I think it really is to Cyborg's benefit as well that Kunitskaya, unlike Holm, is an orthodox fighter. And I think that was a big part of what gave Cyborg some trouble against Holm. She had a different sort of angle, different set of angles to deal with, more distance to cover. Kunitskaya is going to give her the openings, is going to really give her the openings that Cyborg has spent most of her fight camps for the last several years preparing for. So yeah, I think it could be interesting. Kunitskaya is tough. She's got excellent conditioning, and she keeps her composure really well. She doesn't seem to panic or freak out or exhaust herself unless it's absolutely necessary for her to expend a lot of energy. And so down the stretch, I like it. Kunitskaya definitely has a shot, but only if Cyborg A is not in peak shape or has been seriously adversely affected by the weight cut, and B doesn't wipe her out in the first couple of rounds. And I kind of feel that that's going to happen. I'm kind of going with a Cyborg early knockout. I know that's probably not. I'm not going to rock the boat or shock any of our listeners too much with that prediction, but that does feel like another typical Cyborg result for this one.
Yeah, the reason why the orthodox piece matters so much here is because of Cyborg's jab. She's got a really, really nice jab, and she did not feel especially comfortable jabbing a southpaw in Holly Holm. Whereas I think she's going to be perfectly comfortable jabbing with Kunitskaya. And if she can jab her, I think that also mitigates to some extent the conditioning issue. It's going to make it easier for her to box for stretches and just kind of stick her at range and score. Where against Holm, I think Cyborg felt a lot of pressure to make the most of the opportunities that she got. That when Holm gave her an opening, Cyborg felt like she needed to throw 2, 3, 4 power shots to really capitalize, to put her stamp on it. Because as we saw, the judges had no idea what the fuck they were watching.
She was right to feel that way because the judges were completely mesmerized as usual by Holm's meaningless volume.
Yeah, if Cyborg had felt content to drop one counter at a time instead of a combination, she might have lost on points despite outlanding Holm 2-1. Like that, and I want to just to make this clear, the trouble, whatever trouble Cyborg had with Holm was minor. I thought she won every round very clearly in that fight. It was not a close fight. It was competitive, but it was in no way, shape, or form close. Anybody who gave Holm even a round needs to seriously reconsider what they watched.
100%. Yeah. When I say that Holm troubled Cyborg, I mean she made Cyborg work for it. She didn't. Yes. She wasn't taking rounds off her. She kept her honest throughout the fight.
Yeah. Those 48-47 scorecards were just like, what the fuck were you watching? Like that was, we focus a lot on bad scorecards when the decisions go the wrong way.
Yeah.
Those tend to draw our ire, but 2 48-47 scorecards in that fight is absolutely unforgivable. And it speaks to every single kind of stereotypical problem we've ever raised with MMA judging, that if you can look at that fight and score 2 rounds for Holly Holm, it just shows how kind of fundamentally broken a lot of the judging is in this sport.
For sure. Yeah. But to finish off on the point about the jab, I do want to say that was one of the main things that I thought was lacking in Cyborg's approach to Holly Holm, and it took her a while to get that jab working. And once she did, that was around the point where she started to kind of take over and have a lot less difficulty against an orthodox fighter. I think we're going to see a lot more of what we saw in her fight with Evinger. Where she was able to take her foot off the gas because she was dictating the fight with her jab. I think that's one of Cyborg's best weapons, and looking forward to seeing it in action, but not as much, honestly, as I am looking forward to the co-main event, Pat. I think Frankie Edgar versus Brian Ortega should absolutely be a 5-round fight and is a fascinating matchup between two very, very different, both physically and stylistically, mixed martial artists. What do you think of it, man?
I am super stoked for this. It's always fun to see Frankie Edgar in a 3-round fight just because the pace is so he pushes such a wild pace in these fights in ways that I think at this point, he was always renowned for his pace earlier in his career. And I think ways that kind of blew out of proportion just how much he was actually doing. If you look back to those fights, Frankie Edgar was not landing that much volume.
Oh, yeah,
It was more than a lot of guys at that point were landing, but especially in the context of how MMA looks in 2017, 2018, Edgar was not pushing some sort of wild ass pace.
One of my formative moments as an aspiring analyst was the first time I watched Frankie Edgar, and I was like, wait a minute. Nothing's actually happening. This is not effective. All they keep talking about is his footwork and his pace, and he's doing very little. That was genuinely a transformative realization for me.
Yeah, but now kind of as time has gone on, Edgar has actually become a much bigger pace guy.
Absolutely.
He has actually started to do more. His footwork has gotten better to the point where it actually deserves the accolades he got earlier in his career. And I think in a 3-round fight with Brian Ortega, we are going to see all of the very best aspects of Edgar's game because I think the things that he has a command of are precisely the things that are going to give Ortega real trouble. I think the precision with which Edgar moves through the cage, I think his ability to get in and out and not be there for the counters that Ortega is going to want to throw. I think Edgar should feel comfortable shooting for takedowns and working from the top against Ortega. I don't think he needs to be worried about getting caught quite the same way that somebody like Cub Swanson, who has a history of kind of losing focus in those moments.
Yeah.
I don't think he needs to worry about that quite the way that Swanson and some of the other guys that Ortega has fought needs to. And I think, frankly, Edgar's top game is so devastating at this point that he would be silly to treat this as a pure striking match. I think he can and should try to beat up Ortega from the top.
Yeah, I think so too. Frankie Edgar is at his best when he feels like he can use the full breadth of his game. We see like the Jose Aldo fights. We see half Frankie Edgar, half at his best, compared to when he's fighting like Cub Swanson, and he can both outbox, out-wrestle, and both. He can do all three: outbox, out-wrestle, and out-grapple somebody. And it's really the interplay between all those different phases that makes Frankie Edgar so mind-blowingly good. Or like the Yair Rodriguez fight, like just seeing how the footwork, and the movement, and the striking leads into the wrestling, how the wrestling transitions into the grappling, and back and forth, strikes between wrestling and striking. That's like my favorite aspect of Frankie Edgar's game. I will say, if I was Frankie Edgar, I would be. I think the takedowns should absolutely come. I love that Frankie Edgar knee tap. I want to see some work from the body lock if they tie up in the clinch. I would be pretty nervous though about shooting and giving my neck to Brian Ortega, because the speed and confidence with which Ortega took Cub Swanson's neck in their fight, like the moment Cub didn't have his head under the armpit the first time at the end of the first round. He wasn't really in a bad position. He was just kind of resting, and Ortega snapped him down into the front headlock and very nearly finished him with a darce. And then when the same thing happened in the second round, leading to the guillotine rather than the darce, it had been an entire round up to that point of Cub clinching perfectly. Every time Ortega came in, Cub was following Greg Jackson's advice in the corner from between rounds. He was maintaining solid head position. He was not changing levels, and he was looking to disengage. The moment that Ortega managed to kind of shift his feet aside and get Cub a little off balance, his posture was a little broken, guillotine, fight's over. And that's the kind of stuff that, like, Frankie Edgar is a fascinating fight, because it is a guy who has gotten nothing but finish wins inside of the UFC versus the former champion who has never been finished in his entire career. But that would be the one area where, if I'm Frankie Edgar, I would maybe try to avoid any kind of takedown where I really give my neck to Brian Ortega and allow him to maintain a stable position while my posture is broken and he gets to look at the back of my head, I'm
with you to the extent that is exactly what I was talking about in terms of lapses. That Cub always has lapses like that. Like, it's just one of the baseline facts of his style. It's how he got finished by Ricardo Lamas. It's how he ended up getting taken down against Frankie Edgar in a fight where early on he was doing fine against Frankie Edgar, and then there was a brief lapse. He gets taken down, and the whole tenor of the fight changes. And that's the kind of thing that happens with Cub. Like, that's just it is an unavoidable piece of who he is as a fighter, that occasionally he kind of loses focus for a second and ends up in those positions. Whereas I would say the defining aspect of Frankie Edgar's style is that he does not lose focus. Like, he is there the whole time. You know what I mean? Like, he just does not make it when he's in kind of a grappling or wrestling position, you do not see those kinds of lapses from him.
Yeah, he's not, like any fighter, he's not immune to making mistakes. He's obviously, we know Frankie Edgar's been caught quite a bit, although it is fair to say that he's more prone to making mistakes as a striker, and I think less now than ever before, than he is as a grappler. Like, Frankie
That's what Edgar's, I mean, is when he has time to think through it, you very rarely see that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to think back. The last guy who was Jeremy Stevens, I guess, briefly attempted a submission on him, but that one was just kind of a bullshit, like more of a headlock than anything, if memory serves, right? So what's striking to me is, even in fights that have included a large amount of grappling, how few guys have even been able to get off submission attempts against Frankie. Like
Rodriguez, Yair went for a Hail Mary knee bar, and Frankie whooped his ass for it. He punished him so viciously for latching onto his leg.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I mean, is how rarely Frankie even gets into a position where he gives up a submission attempt, much less one that ever gets close. Like, I'm trying to think, when the only tight submission attempt I can ever remember is in that first Benson Henderson fight. And even that wasn't that close, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. There have to be some others. I think when he fought like Mark Bocek might have gotten him in a submission. There has to be some others in there.
So that was like 2007.
Yeah. It's been a little while since Frankie Edgar's been in trouble on the ground. The caution comes from the fact that Brian Ortega is not a conventional submission grappler. That you don't have to be in a position where you would normally be on the lookout for submissions. He's extremely opportunistic, especially with those front headlocks. So, but if I'm Frankie Edgar, I'm happy to be on top of Brian Ortega, to keep him on his back and to work him over with elbows and to show him, maybe, dishearten him a little bit, show him that I'm actually a phenomenally good on the ground and am not easy to catch in any kind of submissions. Your guard game is very unlikely to work against me. That's the message I'm trying to send.
This is, Frankie Edgar is by a long stretch the best top control grappler that Ortega will have ever faced. The most technically sound, the strongest base, the best posture, the most dangerous ground strikes. I think, and just the utter lack of fucking up. That's what really, of all the things that stand out about Frankie's grappling game, I think he's got a great base, like a really, really strong base. That stands out. But the biggest one is just that he just doesn't fuck up. He doesn't make mistakes. Like, he's always where he needs to be. His posture is always where it needs to be. He's always got an underhook when he needs an underhook. He's always got his hips where they need to be. Like, I think it's the best part of his game, which is saying something considering how complete a fighter he is at this point. I want to come back real quick to the Yair Rodriguez fight.
Okay, because why don't we take a quick break, actually? If you don't mind. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we will wrap up our discussion on Edgar Ortega and then move on to some of the other fights from this undercard, namely Sean O'Malley versus Andre Sukumtat. Very interested to see where Sean O'Malley can go after his scintillating UFC debut, and more after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
Welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's continue talking about Frankie Edgar versus Brian Ortega. Pat, you had a point that I so rudely prevented you from sharing in the first segment. Would you please continue?
It was really rude, and I'm glad that you acknowledged that.
I don't want to sweep anything under the rug. I don't want the listeners to think that there's some bad blood between us. I want everything to be on the air, out in the open. I fucked up. I really disrespected you, and I'm sorry.
As a person,
yeah. As a human being, I mean, you deserved better. And so now's your chance to, say that stupid shit you were going to say.
Okay, so what I was going to say before I was so rudely interrupted by the fact that we needed to take a break because we'd been talking for like 25 fucking minutes.
Yeah.
What I was going to say was I want to come back to the Yair Rodriguez fight real quick because it is easy to forget because it became such a wipeout that the first 3 minutes of that fight were extremely competitive, especially on the feet. Like, Frankie had to overcome some adversity in terms of fighting a guy who was much taller, much longer, did a good job with his reach, and was landing good shots. He landed a bunch of really good kicks. Frankie had some trouble closing the distance with him and getting it to the point where he needed to get it before he could start working those takedowns. It was it was calm and methodical, and a lot of guys who did not have the depth of experience that Frankie has or the kind of array of tools at his disposal would have gotten frustrated and would have found themselves in real serious trouble with a guy like Yair Rodriguez, because Rodriguez looked good on the feet. He looked sharper. His footwork looked better. He looked like he had a better awareness of where he was in the cage. I think it's easy to look back on that fight and say, well, yeah, the veteran just kind of beat up the unprepared prospect. Rodriguez was prepared for that. He was prepared for what Frankie had to offer, and Frankie still beat him down. So that to me is one of the more impressive performances from Frankie Edgar in recent years. And I think it should be acknowledged that, like, this dude still has everything, as far as we can tell, left in the tank. There is no decline. He's getting smarter. He's getting better, which, you know, as two guys who have not been huge fans of Frankie Edgar over the years, I think it's worth noting that.
Oh, yeah. I went from being genuinely a Frankie Edgar hater to now a serious fan. Like, I have so much appreciation for the depth and the craft of Frankie Edgar's game. And he's also, obviously, just a tough motherfucker and insanely mentally and physically durable. And, but, you know, like, so is Brian Ortega. And I do think there's something to be said for that Yair Rodriguez fight of, yes, Yair was tactically prepared for how he was going to approach Frankie Edgar, but I don't think he was mentally prepared for how that fight turned out. I think he was quite shaken by the end of the first round, by the success. I mean, he still went for, like I said, that Hail Mary knee bar attempt. He was still going for things, trying to make something happen, but I think he was shaken. And I don't think that happens to Brian Ortega. At least I haven't seen it happen yet. That's one of the scarier things about Brian Ortega, is that he's not like a walk you down Terminator type, but he kind of gives you that vibe because nothing seems to rattle him. He's just like slowly improving technically. By the way, since I began shouting out a few episodes ago fighters who do actually use shoulder rolls, Brian Ortega, baby. T-City likes that shoulder roll. He's not super great at it yet, but he does like trying to catch right hands on his shoulder.
So I want to break this down a little bit. What do you make of Ortega's striking game?
I think it's just a little piecemeal. I really think it's coming together pretty well. He's building reactions. The problem he has is when because I think he recognizes that he needs to improve his defense, that he needs to be harder to hit. That's obvious, but he's been taught that lesson from a few fights. So in that Cub Swanson fight, like, he was trying. The problem was that he kind of got lost in trying to determine what he was doing defensively. He kind of got lost trying to read Cub Swanson's moves, and that's when Cub was really styling on him. When Cub is so good, if you wait on him to lead and just let him pick targets and mix things up and play with tempo, he was throwing Ortega off. When Ortega would try to shoulder roll, it would be the right hand to the body, and then Cub would come back with the left, and then it would be a short combo, and then it would be a jab to the chest, and then it would be one upstairs. Just constant variation from Cub. But, like, the responses were there, and when Ortega was actually throwing back, I think he's developing a pretty decent boxing game. Like, everything is sort of working in concert, where he might get lost in one sort of approach, but when he's flowing, like he does on the ground. His striking, there were a couple moments in that Swanson fight where, like, Cub came forward, Ortega slipped, did a hop step back, came back with a right hand. It didn't land, but it was a nice little sequence of moves that all worked nicely one after the other. I just think it's a matter of time before it actually comes together, and until then, Ortega is still more hittable than he needs to be, and is still not as active as he needs to be. I think he's a little too precious with the openings that he will actually take. Another big difference between him and Frankie Edgar, somebody who will take absolutely any opening that you give him and is not picky in the slightest. But I don't think, unless Ortega has learned that lesson before this fight, I'm not sure that he'll be able to trouble Frankie Edgar much on the feet, despite the big reach advantage.
See, I think he could trouble Frankie a little bit on the feet, because he's willing and able to hang in and counter.
Okay.
And I think that's something that has given Frankie trouble over the years, is that Frankie kind of expects guys to react to him. You know, he expects Frankie is going to get in, do his thing, then get out and reset and get you ready for the next thing that's coming, right? When you stand there and are willing and able to counter what Frankie is throwing at you, that's when he runs into some trouble. It disrupts the kind of rhythm and flow of his game. It disrupts the reads that he's making. It disrupts his overall, I mean, up to a point. Frankie does read the counters and does a good job of adjusting to the counters that you show him, but it can make it difficult, especially if you have kind of a varied array of what you can do. If you can mix things up, if you can show him different looks, it disrupts the basic framework of Frankie's game, which is read and react, and kind of build in layers as you go to your responses.
Yeah, and Frankie's not always been like a disruptor of rhythm so much as he is like a very rhythmic fighter. I think it does have an impact when you can kind of interrupt his flow and break the tempo of what he's trying to do to you.
Yeah, he can make it tough. I think that's where Ortega could really give him trouble, is if not so much with the submissions per se, but if he makes it difficult for Frankie to get into a position where he can dominate the flow of the fight. That's what I like. You look back over the years where Frankie very rarely gets dominated himself. Where he struggles is when Frankie can't impose his flow to things. And I think the genius of Ortega's game is that he can make it very difficult for you to impose on him. He's always doing something back to you. He's always dangerous. He's always there, more so than anything else. That's I think if you're looking for the thing that ties together what Ortega does on the feet and what Ortega does on the ground, it's that you can never really rest with him because he's always going to be there waiting for an opportunity and an opening.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, because I think you're right in your assessment of Ortega's striking game, and that it's kind of like there are things that he does where you're like, holy shit, that was slick and interesting, and like, how did you learn to do that? And then there are other things, and then he goes through phases where you're like, what the fuck are you doing? You know, that's so.
It's like he's still discovering how to strike, like how it all works together.
Yeah, which is not uncommon. It's just rare to see a guy who has kind of vaulted up the ranks this quickly.
Yeah.
That, I think, is the kind of unexpected thing, is that you're seeing the pieces come together in big fights with guys that Ortega eventually pulls it out and finds ways to win. That's the kind of unexpected piece about it. So with all that said, I mean, what's your pick here? How do you think the fight will play out?
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like I have to pick Frankie Edgar. I think there are a lot of tactical openings in that I see in Ortega's game on the feet that will allow Edgar to sort of, you know, I think Edgar is going to be able to have a lot of the same success that Cub Swanson had. Edgar is an underrated body puncher. Really still, like, a big problem with Frankie Edgar is that he doesn't seem to, I think he can hit hard. We know he can hit hard. He just still doesn't really commit as much, although I guess that's getting better. It is getting better. Maybe there's a difference there, but like, go back to Frankie Edgar's fight with his rematch with Ben Henderson, and you will see that if only Frankie was delivering more power, he would have been doing serious attritive damage to the body and legs of Ben Henderson in that fight. He's a very good leg kicker, an underrated kicker in general, and quite a good body puncher when he wants to target on it, and that target is going to be there with the big, tall Brian Ortega in front of him. And so I think having this variety of targets and the willingness to take advantage of that variety is going to allow Frankie to kind of, you know, keep Ortega from picking up the pace, force Ortega to sort of get desperate in his efforts to get into the fight, where he's going to try to force something and push forward and make Frankie react. And so long as that doesn't happen, so long as it doesn't happen too early, which is when I think Frankie tends to get surprised. It's kind of interesting because both of these guys seem to improve with each passing round, too. So I don't know if Frankie can actually punish Ortega enough with his strikes to prevent him from building his pace as the fight goes on. But fortunately, Frankie doesn't just have his striking to rely on. He has a whole variety of takedowns, and while I would probably be a little iffy about trying to do some of his usual stuff, using those takedowns to then linger in the clinch and set up shots, I do think that he's going to be able, with his pot shots, with his changing targets, to force Ortega to come forward, which will allow him to hit reactive takedowns and really dictate where this fight takes place. So I think it'll be dicey. I think it'll be competitive. Ortega has some of that Yoel Romero in him where I don't quite know how to analyze or predict what's going to happen, which is part of why it's so fun to watch him fight. But the general read says Frankie Edgar to me.
Yeah, I'm with that. I think this smells like a competitive 30-27 decision. I think Edgar could have a little more trouble than we're expecting on the feet, and I think he's going to fall back on that wrestling game, fight through a submission attempt or two, and then kind of take over on the mat and just control Ortega in a way that he's not used to being controlled. Like we saw that from Thiago Tavares. Thiago Tavares did a great job on top with Ortega. When you can force, despite the T-City nickname, when you can force Ortega into standard grappling exchanges, get him out of transitions, you take away a lot of what makes him so dangerous. It's those transitions where Ortega is really creative and nasty and can hit you with something before you know it. As good as Ortega's guard is, I don't think a guy like Frankie Edgar should have any qualms about hanging out there. I think he would be totally fine to beat up Ortega from top position. So if and when he can make that happen, and I think he will, don't know that it'll be early, don't know that it's going to be easy to get it to that phase. But if and when he does, I expect him to take over. I think that's how it's going to look. I got 29-28 or 30-27, Frankie.
Sounds about right to me. All right. Well, with that, let's move on for shit. What's next, Pat? Sean O'Malley.
Sean O'Malley.
Oh, Sean O'Malley with with just a great combo of haircut and tattoo selection. I mean, really one of the best in the entire sport. And that's what we're going to be analyzing for this segment. We're just going to talk about Sean O'Malley's hair and his awful tattoos.
That chest piece, man, that is special. That is Komotsi-esque.
Oh, so Sean O'Malley is a hell of a lot of fun. I mean, that has to be said. And he's good. He's not just flash and flair. He has a game that he fully understands. And there's obviously improvements to be made. Things need tightened up, and probably like a lot of young fighters, O'Malley really needs to learn in time how to, kind of control himself, to marshal his resources a little bit, keep some things hidden, and not give his opponent so much information so readily. But for the time being, he looks quite promising to me. The one thing I'll tell you, Pat, that really, really stood out when I just watched his fight with, oh God, who the hell was it? Who's his last guy? Luke
Terry
Sanders.
and Ware?
No, that was Sukumtat's last fight. Terry and Ware. Oh, my dude, Terry and Ware. The thing that really stood out was Sean O'Malley's manipulation of rhythm and his feinting.
Yeah.
He's so tricky with... He's once again, like I said about Edgar, he's not picky about the openings he'll take. He's willing to throw to the body. He does very, very well when he can mix up his targets and usually just single shots. Just kind of tricky pot shots. Get in, get out, get in, get out. Sometimes it's a high kick, sometimes it's a body kick, sometimes it's a straight left to the body, sometimes it's a straight left to the head, and then you mix in other little things to make those switch ups more unpredictable. But a big part of what makes it so hard to predict is because not only with O'Malley are you trying to guess where he's going next and with what weapon, but you're trying to figure out when the hell it's coming. He does a lot of busy feinting, a lot of very boxery kind of movements, like sort of little stutter steps before the jab. The jab comes just a half second after you expect it to come. He'll show you the rhythm, show you the load up to the strike, and then follow shortly after. Maybe he'll do that twice. Maybe then he'll do it with no setup, no telegraph whatsoever. Just very dancerly sort of approach to striking from the outside. I'm interested to see how that plays against the counter-punching game of Andrei Sukumtat, which to my eye is what Sukumtat really likes to do, is counter in combination. And he's pretty good at it, but he does not have O'Malley's variation in speed or timing. And so my general feeling here is that O'Malley is going to be able to kind of throw off Sukumtat's triggers. But I'm still curious to know if you think Sukumtat's reach will make O'Malley's job a little more difficult than it usually has been.
Yeah, I think what really stands out to me about O'Malley is exactly what you pointed to. It's the rhythm manipulation and the fact that there seems to be a lot of depth to his game. Mm-hmm. A shocking amount of depth for a guy who is as young in the sport as he is. O'Malley will have been a pro for 3 years, week after this fight. He had a bunch of amateur fights too, so it's not like he's a total novice and all we have to go by is the pro career. He's young, but he's got a lot of depth to what he does in the cage, a shocking amount. There is nobody he reminds me of so much as Conor McGregor his last few fights before he got into the UFC, with the wild array of things that he's doing that's built on a really strong kind of fundamental foundation of and awareness of who and what he is as a fighter. You know, like that McGregor, we haven't seen this much from him in the UFC, but he would shoot takedowns. He would be willing to grapple. He did a lot of kind of mix up and change up things. He stutter stepped a lot. Like after he got into the UFC, we saw a lot more kind of straightforward stuff from McGregor than he showed in his last few fights on the regional scene. Like there was a depth and kind of breadth of skill that he showed off that he kind of abandoned for a while. Whereas O'Malley is all about that. You have no idea what's coming from him. And that's not in the way that a lot of guys are just throwing variety out there because they're like, oh, look at some of the cool shit that I learned. There's a sense to it.
It's informed variety.
Yes, exactly. What stands out to me about this matchup with Sukumtat is I think you're right to point to the combination counterpunching of Sukumtat. Where I think Sukumtat is going to be in real trouble is with the volume that O'Malley throws out there. I do not think that Sukumtat can fight at the pace that O'Malley is going to want to push.
Yeah.
O'Malley is going to be vulnerable because O'Malley he has a lot of defensive moves, but there is not really like a super coherent, layered plan to O'Malley's defense. He can and will get hit in this fight. But I think at the end of the day, I just think he's going to outland Sukumtat about 2-1. I just don't think Sukumtat can keep that pace with O'Malley.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely good point. Sukumtat had to fight a very slow pace with Alejandro Perez, and even though I thought that he probably deserved the nod in that fight, he kind of failed to put his stamp on the bout because he was like just knocking Alejandro Perez down with a jab every 3 minutes and doing very little else besides. There's a lot to like about Sukumtat's game. He's a very good body puncher. He's got a really nice long straight jab, and those counter combos are going to be a factor because of the way that O'Malley kind of likes to dip in and then, as you said, sort of out of position sometimes, sort of leaning away, just sort of, assuming that whatever's coming back at him is not going to be adjusted for where he's going. That it's sort of like he's not a rote fighter, but he expects his opponent to be. And so if Sukumtat comes back with a straight right and then steps out and throws the left hook wide as O'Malley slips out to that side, the opening is going to be there probably, at least a few times in the early going. And that counter-punching acumen is going to be interesting. But the volume of O'Malley plus the trickiness with the rhythm, that is a really difficult thing for somebody whose main approach to fighting is counter-punching to deal with. To have somebody just fucking with your triggers nonstop, just constantly not allowing you to pick up on a pattern in their approach. And I think that's going to be too much for Sukumtat.
Yeah, if Sukumtat threw more or were more comfortable throwing, I would say that he could kind of aggressively pressure O'Malley and then try to counter the counter, to draw out O'Malley's counters and then counter him. But Sukumtat, he can move forward a little bit, but he's not super, at least not as far as I've seen. I don't think he's super comfortable getting after you and pressuring. And I think it's very hard to pressure O'Malley with footwork. I think you need to pressure him with strikes, which is something Terrion Ware did a lot of. Terrion Ware did a great job of using kind of arcing strikes to cut off O'Malley's lateral movement to force him back. because every time that fight was in the middle of the cage, Ware was getting lit up. And I think the same thing will be true here with Sukumtat. I think Sukumtat needs to press him back, but I think he's going to have a lot of trouble doing that.
Yeah. Sukumtat strikes me as somebody who could fight with more volume, but he throws everything with power, which is why the combinations all come at the same rate. They're not tricky in that sense because everything is loaded up exactly the same way. And if he could just let things go, we were talking on the break about Srisaket Sorungvasai versus Juan Francisco Estrada. We're not going to talk about it on this episode, but just as an aside, go fucking watch that fight because it was awesome. But that was a big change for Sorungvasai, is being able to just throw shots away, to just let his hands fly and not worry about putting any power on them. And it made him really competitive down the stretch where, compared to his first fight with Roman Gonzalez, he had seriously faded down the stretch. It allowed him to hang around for a lot longer, despite being mostly an all-power punch boxer. And I think Sukumtat's in the same situation. Until he learns to just throw and just let the mechanics of the strike deliver the force and not load up, he's going to have trouble with guys like O'Malley.
Yeah, well, he's an athlete. He's fast. He's used to being the faster guy. And I think that too is going to be a problem here. Where Terrion Ware kind of paradoxically was at an advantage in this sense because he wasn't expecting to outspeed O'Malley. Ware is not an especially fast or athletic guy, was aware that he's not especially fast or athletic. And so he knew that he was going to need to make it ugly against O'Malley, that was going to be his shot of winning that fight. Whereas I think Sukumtat could really easily get lulled into kind of the kind of open space kickboxing match that suits O'Malley.
For sure.
So, I mean, I think Sukumtat is a really good fighter. He kind of got screwed in his first two decisions in the UFC. He was really competitive with Albert Morales. He may have won that fight. I did think he beat Alejandro Perez. But if he gets suckered into that kind of open space fight here, he's either going to get knocked out or he's going to get outlanded 2-1. So, but as far as O'Malley is concerned, what do you think he needs to work on, Connor? Because he's obviously an incredibly promising young guy.
It's kind of tricky. I think O'Malley could stand to. I think O'Malley could stand to learn to stand his ground a little from time to time. There were some dicey moments in the Terrion Ware fight, and they didn't really amount to much. O'Malley looked good in that fight. I thought he was mostly in control. But there were some dicey moments where I was thinking, if a more athletic fighter, somebody who can really drive forward, somebody who can shock you with their speed and just explode into you, were to get these reactions out of Sean O'Malley, were to have as easy a time of forcing him back, and he was a little too reluctant to stand his ground and cut a tight little angle or stay there and smother the power coming at him. So it would be interesting to see him do that, but honestly, I don't think it's really going to matter in this matchup because I don't really see Sukumtat coming forward. I see Sukumtat just kind of stalking. So, I don't know. What about you? Do you have any things you'd like to see from O'Malley?
Just efficiency. Yeah. Instead of the big movements, especially as he's trying to get out of range and get back to open space, just tighter angles, which I think is something he's perfectly capable of doing. He has the feel for it already, which is big. It's not the most natural thing to fight off your back foot the way that he does and draw guys in. The fact that it would be for me.
It is for me.
That's why I don't do that and never have felt comfortable doing that. The fact that he has those instincts already, that I don't necessarily like his reactions when he gets back to the cage, but he is aware of where the cage is and what he needs to do at that point, which is most of the battle. But I'd like to see tighter footwork. I think I like this little stutter steps, but he leans on it too much. And he throws himself forward into his punches more than he needs to. Sometimes just plant your ground, pivot, or just plant your feet, pivot on that foot and just throw. Just let it go. You don't need to throw your weight forward into the shot to generate power. And I think that those two things, I think, are going to make it a lot less likely for him to run into gas tank problems, even maintaining the kind of volume that he threw against Terrion Ware. If he can just not move in such big explosive movements, if he can every once in a while, doesn't have to be all the time. Instead of stutter stepping forward into a shot, just plant his feet, throw, and then move. Like that takes like half the energy to do that. Like, so I think those couple of things would go a long way. Skill set wise, I think his instincts are great.
Yeah.
Like, I think his defensive instincts are great. I think his awareness of the cage is great.
And he seems to be in great shape and to be able to work a lot for a long time, but so did Gavin Tucker in his UFC debut. And he still really blew his wad in his second fight with our boy, Rick Glenn. That's right. Glenn. Rick Glenn, who had a fantastic mustache on that night. It could still happen. So efficiency is still a factor, even if you seem to be a fighter in great condition who can just go for days. Because you can still be made to panic or freak out if you've suddenly faced somebody who can put you out of position and make you work to get back. So.
Yeah. I had one more thing I wanted to mention here, which I was recalling a conversation that I had like a few months ago, because I realized we've never really talked about John Crouch on this show. We've never really talked about the MMA lab as a camp, I don't think.
Zane on the Vivisection used to make fun of me because I always liked John Crouch.
Yeah, I'm a fan too. I just think for whatever reason he has not really come up that much. And I would say, our metric for coaching quality on this show is usually not what do you do with your elite talents. It's what you do with kind of middling guys. That's the truest test of what kind of coach you are. And I would say that by that metric, John Crouch is one of the very best coaches in MMA. Like, that he consistently puts guys who are not like elite talents in great position to win fights.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you could probably you could give him some credit for the longevity of Ben Henderson. Like that. There's probably an argument to be made that Ben Henderson was past his prime well before we really realized it, and was slipping in ways that are now becoming more evident. But hung around and was always difficult to beat. And some of that comes down to, John Crouch's strategizing and game planning. There is another fight on this card that we would talk about if we hadn't talked about it already. I think we covered it in about a little 10-minute chat on episode 196, I think it was. It was originally scheduled for the undercard of Machida versus Anders in Belém. And this is Pedro Munoz versus John Dodson. So if you want to hear us break down that fight, we do think it's worth breaking down. We are interested in it, but we already discussed it. And it just didn't happen because of weight issues. So go check that out if you want to hear us break it down. Otherwise, let's very quickly run through the other interesting bantamweight fight here on this card. This is actually down on the Fight Pass prelims. Brian Caraway makes his long-awaited return. I know people have been dying to see Brian Caraway back in the cage against Cody Stamann, who had a very notable win over one of our favorites, certainly one of Pat's favorites, Tom Duquesnoy, in his last fight. What do you make of this matchup, my friend?
I really like Cody Stamann. That's the biggest. That's my biggest takeaway. Having watched his first two UFC fights, I like what he brings to the table. I like his combination punching. I like the fact that he's a short guy who kicks, who doesn't just give away long range. I like his takedown game. I like the fact that he's a bricked up little dude. Like that's one of my favorite types of fighters right there. Is just the built like a brick shithouse featherweight or bantamweight.
The Chad Mendes Club.
Yeah, or the Jimmy Rivera, I love those dudes. So I'm a fan of Cody Stamann. I think he's a really tough matchup for Caraway. The volume and the pace that Stamann can keep is extraordinary. And I think that is where Caraway usually makes his hay, is by kind of wearing you down as the fight goes on. I don't think he's going to be able to do that to Stamann. Stamann gets stronger as the fight goes on. Also, Caraway, not a fantastic defensive wrestler. And I think that's going to get him in trouble here, because he's going to try to move in, try to pressure Stamann. He's going to eat combinations, and I think he's going to be open to reactive takedowns as he comes forward and tries to move in. Stamann, I don't think, is going to try to keep him down, but as a change of pace, I think it could give Caraway real trouble.
I love those, man. I'm not actually trying to grapple you. I just want to stop you moving forward takedowns. One of my favorites.
Stamann is really good at those. So
yeah,
I think Stamann wins. That's my take.
I could see them trading takedowns. Like I'm glad you brought that up, because obviously the conventional wisdom would be that Brian Caraway is the wrestler in this matchup. He certainly has more depth to his wrestling and grappling games. And I think that Stamen would probably find himself in serious trouble if he were to stick around on the ground with Caraway, even taking top position. Caraway is very, very clever in how he can work himself back into a reshoot kind of situation and end up in a dominant position. But Caraway, I think, is going to have to pressure, because even though Stamen doesn't have a reach advantage, I think Stamen is a much sharper and more concise striker from long range. He's got a good kicking game, as you pointed out. He has a very nice left hook and a good jab to kind of disguise it. He doesn't really tend to throw a ton of combinations. When he does, they're pretty short. And so he kind of just is a surprisingly effective short-armed little pot shotter. And Brian Caraway doesn't have the reach to strike with him in any way, but I mean, I don't know that Brian Caraway knows how to strike in any way but coming forward, unless he's against like an absolutely flat Eddie Wineland. So yeah, I kind of like Stamen too, but I have also counted Caraway out, as have many people many times, and he is a rugged motherfucker. So I cannot count him out in this matchup, especially because Stamen has yet to really have the whole depth of his fighting game tested. He looked perfectly well prepared for Duquesnoy. I think that was the biggest thing that stood out, is that he looked like he knew exactly what he needed to do to defuse the bomb in front of him. And I expect that, despite Caraway being a very different opponent, he will approach this fight with a similar level of sort of intelligence and poise. So Cody Stamen for me too. And that's it for us for UFC 222. After the break, we are going to come back for a short segment 3 in which we're going to look back on our favorite outcomes, results, whatever you want to call it, from this last week's UFC card, Jeremy Stephens versus Josh Emmett, after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's take a trip back in time to last weekend, a long-away era known as UFC on Fox 28, Emmett versus Stephens. It's already leaving my mind, Pat, that this fight happened, but it was fun to watch. The main event, as everybody expected it to be, between two bangers, was a good show. Did anything about this featherweight main event surprise you?
No, it looked exactly like I thought it would. That's
including like the Jeremy Stephens kind of having to get woken up in the opening round.
Yeah, it looked exactly like I thought it was going to look. That it's funny, that rarely happens, that both the main event and Andrade Torres was the co-main event, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, both the main event and the co-main event looked exactly like I thought they were going to look, which rarely happens for me. Like normally, your prediction for how a fight's going to go, you may get the outcome right, you may call a few key things that go on in there, but very rarely do the fights look exactly as you thought they would. Both of these looked exactly like I thought they would. Everything down to Stephens needing to get woken up, everything down to like even a controversial finishing sequence where Jeremy Stephens knees a guy in the face on the ground. Even that sounded about right. That sounded just about perfect.
Also, on that note, I 100% buy Jeremy Stephens' explanation that Tan Dan approached him and gave him a very slipshod explanation of what the new rules were, and that Jeremy Stephens was just careless enough to just take that at face value and just believe going into this fight, though it had never been true in any previous fights, that as long as one hand is not on the ground, you can knee a dude in the fucking face. That is apparently what Tan Dan told him, and that's what Jeremy Stephens had in mind when he tried to take Emmett's head off his shoulders while he was on both knees on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I am aware that that's illegal. I'm aware that we're supposed to be upset about guys finishing fights with illegal shots. I don't feel like that shot should be illegal, so I'm not going to get worked up about it. I realize that's a silly kind of metric, what strikes does Pat think should or should not be illegal. Yeah. That's not like the way that you want to do the rules for a sport. But for me personally, the thing I can control here is how upset or not upset I get about Jeremy Stephens including an illegal knee in a finishing sequence. And to be honest, I don't really give a shit. Like, I think Emmett was going to get out of there one way or the other. The shots that Stephens was landing on him at that point, I think were pointed very clearly to the direction the fight was going, which is, maybe Emmett could have landed something big in a future exchange and knocked Stephens out. I think that's fairly unlikely. I think the tenor of the fight was pretty clear. I think it was only a matter of time before Stephens landed one of those shots to put Emmett down. That happened to be the way that it turned out, but that outcome was in no way surprising. And I don't think that the knee, while it was involved in that finishing sequence, was not like a fluky kind of event that was totally out of character with the rest of the fight.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe I should quibble just for the sake of the show, but now I'm imagining a boxing match in which somebody lands a spinning back fist and is not penalized, and I'm not upset about it. Because I don't think that should be illegal either. Bring back the pivot blow and allow Jeremy Stephens to execute people while they're on their knees. With his own knees.
I mean, it sucks. It sucks for Emmett, but like, I think that's how that fight was going to end anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it sucks. It should have been probably called at the moment and an interruption created. Like, I do think it's fair to be upset about.
Absolutely. I don't take issue with anybody who is going to be upset about that. I think that Emmett should be upset. I think Tan Dan did a shitty job.
Yeah.
Stephens should not have thrown it. See, the thing is, Stephens did not need to throw that knee to end the fight. The fight was probably going to be over anyway.
That's why it doesn't upset me, is that it ends up being inconsequential. And I know that kind of sucks because even inconsequential fouls should be deemed as fouls. It's like I've seen enough boxing matches where somebody gets away with just hitting their opponent in the cup a dozen times, and it doesn't seem to have much of an effect on the guy who's being hit, but they just get away with it. And so you kind of forget about it, and then you're like, oh yeah, that's not supposed to happen. Like there should have been a negative impact on the fight as a result of that. But it happens.
Look, there's a lot of stuff to get upset about in this sport, and you kind of got to pick and choose your spots. And yeah, I mean, like there are enough things that make you deeply question the extent to which you want to watch it anyway. And like, this is just not going to be one of those things for me.
Yeah.
But with that said, I take no issue if you want to be upset about this, and maybe you should. And they absolutely should enforce it. Why the fuck do you have rules if you're not going to enforce it? It's like the debate about how inconsequential it is, or how little is ever going to be done about anything like this. That's the actual meaningful part, not the blow itself. Mm-hmm. Like, it's the fact that nobody in any sort of position to change things is ever going to do anything about the circumstances that led to this not being a consequential foul.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the part. I don't mean to be flippant. I don't mean to imply that Josh Emmett should not be upset about that, because he should be, or that Tandan didn't fuck up because he did fuck up, or that Stephens didn't fuck up because he did. But like, it's more like, this is a consistent thing with fouls in this sport anyway, and so it's just kind of a piece with the sport that we know and love. Mm-hmm. But yeah, otherwise, where does Stephens go from here? Who do you want to see him fight?
I don't know. Jeremy Stephens, I guess, is a top 5 featherweight now. I was a little irked by that idea, like, because Josh Emmett's top 5 ranking doesn't mean all that much. I mean, he certainly deserved the win over Ricardo Lamas, but he's done nothing else to establish himself here. He just happened to beat the number 3 featherweight. But really, like, Jeremy Stephens, could you rank him over, if Emmett's now out of the top 5, and then you put Stephens like one behind Cub Swanson at the number 5 slot? That makes sense to me. And so then if that's the case, I want to see Jeremy Stephens fight somebody who they're trying to set up for the title. So maybe if he can get another fight before then, like somebody like Volkanovski versus Jeremy Stephens might be pretty awesome. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I want to see him against the prospects.
Right.
I want to see him fight Volkanovski or Mirsad Bektic.
Yeah, because I think at this point in Jeremy Stephens' career, like a win over one of the really top prospects over Zabit or Volkanovski could I think be enough to earn him a title shot. He's beat Doo Ho Choi. Like, these are the top up and comers in the division, but also
I'm not expecting Jeremy Stephens to break through into title contention. I still feel like he should be used sort of as now a very high-level gatekeeper. So
yeah, he should be a gatekeeper to the top 5 for some of the wealth of talent that they have in this division. It's time to start getting those guys over, and start putting them up there, because right now Ortega was the first one to kind of make the leap to get up there. He's clearly in that crew, but you have other guys who are sticking around in the top 10 at this point, like Lamas. I think Lamas loses to guys like Bektic and Volkanovski. I think there are other guys on the outside too who are ready to kind of move up into that space. Like this is a division that's ready for a turnover and happens to have guys like Lamas and Stephens who can give those up and comers tests.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That is like now for the next couple years, I think it's going to be guys like Lamas and Stephens fighting guys like Zabit, Bektic, Volkanovski. There's a couple others as well. But yeah, I think, man, Bektic Stephens would be pretty awesome, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's the fight I want to see.
Yeah, that would be kind of like a supercharged version. I mean, my imagination sets it as a supercharged version of Stephens' fight with Dennis Bermudez, which, while somewhat forgotten, was a fucking awesome fight when it happened. So, yeah, that sounds like fun. How about the co-main event? Jessica Andrade, Tisha Torres. Overall read from you?
Again, it's very strangely, it looked exactly like I thought it was going to look, where Andrade was going to have some real trouble getting in on a really good outfighter who throws really nice combinations, a really nice straight right hand, who did a great job of not standing in front of Andrade. Mm-hmm. But eventually, Andrade was able to kind of track her down, walk through the damage, land her strikes, and more than anything, was able to get in on her takedowns. Like, I really... Like if you'll recall in our pre-fight discussion, I pinpointed kind of the deterioration of Tisha Torres' takedown defense. Yep. And that was exactly the problem here. As soon as Andrade was able to get in on her hips, the strength differential was just so clear, and Andrade was able to toss her around. And make her hay and put her stamp on the fight, and that's more or less what happened.
Yeah, it really... I thought that Tisha Torres fought a very good fight. I really think it... Like there were a friend of the show, Schwan Humes, was talking to me on Twitter about this. He said the same thing, like he basically said exactly what you said last week. Hey, I watched Tisha Torres get taken down and controlled by Michelle Watterson, so I knew this was going to happen. Had very little doubt that Andrade was going to be able to use her wrestling to an advantage as well. But he also pointed out that Torres could have used more variety to her striking, but I think that's been the case for a while. The deterioration of her wrestling has been a more recent thing, but for some time, Torres has not displayed, I think, the same kind of boxing that she was showing in her earliest fights, where she was a real tricky kickboxer. Would throw good combinations. She had a left hook back then, and would like set up her punches with her kicks and the other way around. And she hasn't been that way for a while, but like expecting to see something like the same striking out of Tisha Torres that I've seen in recent fights, as I thought she did everything in her power to keep Jessica Andrade from using her physical advantages. She did a great job of managing distance as long as she could. Really, what ended up happening to her was very similar to what ended up happening to Angela Hill, where she came to this point where she felt she had no choice but to sit down on something to scare Andrade off. She had to make her respect something, and that's all it takes for Andrade to start getting the fight she needs to win. Once you plant your feet and stand your ground, it's like you are now in her world. Now she's latched onto you. Now she's hitting you to the body. Now she feels confident because she started to put her hands on you. Andrade needs something more, though, if she's going to contend, especially if Joanna wins the title again. I think Rose Namajunas is potentially a more forgiving matchup for Andrade. And Andrade is certainly talented enough to be in title contention again. But, she still doesn't know how to sidestep. She doesn't know how to cut off the cage at all. And for a pressure fighter, I compare her to John Lineker all the time, but John Lineker can cut off the cage. John Lineker can keep pressure.
But it took Lineker a long time to figure out how to do that.
Sure.
Lineker was not a natural pressure fighter. Lineker, like Andrade, I think they're both brawlers who have been taught to pressure. and to some extent. And Lineker has been taught to pressure better than Andrade has. Andrade needs to figure that out.
Yeah.
But once Lineker figured out that pressuring was the best way for him to get to put his pressure on guys, he really kind of embraced it and figured things out. Andrade, I don't know if it's because the camp she's at is not ATT, or which is where Lineker really put his game together and learned how to do the things that he wanted to do. Mm-hmm. I think Andrade maybe needs to break out of her mold a little bit. Like she keeps getting better at the things that she does, but not at the things that she doesn't do. And I think you're right. I think she would really struggle against Jędrzejczyk again. Obviously, I think you easily pick Jędrzejczyk to win that fight. Against Namajunas, I think Namajunas' raw speed of hand and foot would give Andrade huge problems. Oh, yeah. Whether she could stick to a game plan long enough and stay disciplined, I think is where Andrade has a slightly better shot in that fight. But the length and the speed and just the way that Namajunas kind of glides through open space, I think would be deeply, deeply, deeply troubling for Andrade.
Yeah, it would be a matter of how long could Namajunas stick to her fundamentals without letting that pressure get to her, the way it did when she fought like Kovalkiewicz. And sort of buckled. Whereas Jędrzejczyk, under that Andrade pressure, because Andrade didn't cut off the cage at all, just masterfully outmaneuvered her. And who knows? If Tisha Torres had longer arms, she might have been able to do the same thing here. And instead, she just got kind of caught in the same trap that Angela Hill and Claudia Gadelha did, where she fought a great fight until suddenly she realized too late she was fighting Andrade's fight. But as long as you cannot fight so perfectly that you keep Andrade from using her physicality, then you can't beat her because she's insane. She's so durable. She doesn't seem fazed by anything, and she doesn't wear out. She can push a crazy pace and seems to never get tired, and she's incredibly strong. She was flinging Tisha Torres around from positions where she did not have the dominant position. She just threw her in the air to her back on the ground. Like, if Andrade can use her physicality, she's going to win. Although the other side to that is that if Andrade can't use her physicality, she will, as in the case of the Jędrzejczyk fight, lose badly because she doesn't have a ton else. As you said, she's really improved what she was already good at, but has not really expanded her game at all in the UFC. So, last words for this card. We'll have to do this fairly quickly, but Max Griffin versus Mike Perry. I would say I told you so, except that I underestimated full camp, full-time fighting Max Griffin, who fought a very smart fight against Mike Perry, who, had to brawl because they matched him with somebody that he would have to brawl with unless, as I said, he could knock him out early, which he didn't, and in fact ended up losing and getting knocked down now for the third time in his 7-fight UFC career. Mike Perry needs a goddamn vacation, Pat.
Yeah, you were absolutely right about your read on this, and I was absolutely wrong about it. What seemed very clear to me after this fight, about halfway through this fight, it was clear to me, is that Perry is beat up.
Yeah.
Like, I don't so much mean like his head, and though he's taken a lot of headshots in these fights, what I mean is like his explosiveness and athleticism in his first couple of UFC fights was just shocking. It was shocking how fast he would get on guys when he exploded into him. This fight, he looked like he had no pop.
Mm-hmm.
He looked slow. He looked slow,
overtrained.
Yeah. Looked slow of foot, slow of hand. He wasn't making good reads. He wasn't doing the things that brung him to the dance in the first place. Like, compare the version of this of Perry that fought Danny Roberts to this version in what was another kind of a war of a fight. But like, Perry looked much better physically in that fight than he did in this one. He looked better against Ponzinibbio than he did in this one. Like, Griffin is a fine fighter. Takes absolutely nothing away from Max Griffin. But frankly, I thought Perry has fought guys in the past who were kind of more skilled than Griffin as outside strikers, were better at sticking and moving, were better at sitting down on things. And Perry did better against those guys than he did against Griffin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he even had more dramatic moments of success against Joban, who dominated him down the back half of their fight. But Perry actually had some pretty big moments in the first round and in the beginning of the second round, if I recall correctly. Against Griffin, he had some moments, but they had to come late. It had to be as a result of Mike Perry's heart. And the fact, like, Griffin is not, this is Griffin's first time fighting like that. You know, it's not like he's a super experienced outfighter who's been doing this his whole career. He was a little shaky with some of his P's and Q's and was getting caught out of position. But Perry, he didn't seem to know how to set anything up. He wasn't creative at all in how he threw his attacks, and just ended up looking, like the worst combination of mentally fatigued and physically flat. Speaking of, I mean, you mentioned Jessica Andrade or John Lineker going to ATT. Like, a lot of people have been saying they think Mike Perry, living in Florida, probably needs to hit ATT. I always hesitate to give like specific camp recommendations for fighters. I don't know their circumstances, but it does feel like Perry could use A, some time off, B, some kind of camp change, someone to just maybe get him excited again and breathe a little life into his game and bring some new dimension to it, and C, some actual careful fucking matchmaking from the promotion that's supposed to be looking out for his best interest. At least if the UFC treated him like a fucking commodity, they would take better care of him than they are right now. At least if they treated him like a thing that was to be valued. But instead, like, this is Mike Perry's tune-up, and worse than I even expected, he lost what was supposed to be his tune-up because they will not give him a forgiving fight. So yeah. Well, here we are. Yep. Don't get a tattoo on your face until you're sure you've made it. And Mike Perry should now be saying that to himself again, because maybe the dream will slip away just when he thought he'd finally hit that face tattoo period. And it's sad because you and I both believe, Pat, that Mike Perry has a lot of potential and is just naturally adept and powerful and durable and has a tremendous heart and is also like a charismatic, interesting person. So he is somebody who really should be treated as, a commodity worth protecting, an asset. You may not like the thing that Mike Perry is, but there is a thing there. Oh yeah. Right. And that's kind of like, I don't think either you or I approves of some of the things that Perry says or the stances that he takes, or what have you, but there is a thing there. And normally if you have a thing, you put some time into it and you try to figure out what can you do with this thing. And the UFC seems to have figured with Perry that the thing that they will do with this thing that they have on their hands is just toss him into a meat grinder and feel comfortable with like, oh, if he just gets chewed up, then fuck it. Who cares? There'll be another Mike Perry out there. And maybe they're right about that. But I think, as with so many things, that's not a real sustainable way of running this. And and even on the individual level, there may be another Mike Perry out there, but what could Mike Perry have been if you just tossed him away? How much better might he have gotten if things had gone differently? How much more career? Like, the point is that, like, these guys are money making opportunities, right? Like, that's what I meant when I said a thing. Like, there's a talent, or there's a charisma, or there's some kind of an appeal, even if you don't like what that appeal is. Yeah. There is a thing there. There's a magnetism. But you're never going to figure out what that thing, how much money that thing could make for the UFC if this is what you do with that. Mm-hmm. So I think we've probably spent more time talking about Mike Perry than we needed to spend talking about Mike Perry on this show. But he is real indicative of some of the genuine weaknesses in the way that the UFC approaches its product. This is partially why we don't have stars. This is partially why we don't have new kind of talents in there. But yeah, no kidding. Oh, well. Well, don't worry. GSP will be back, and then Brock Lesnar will come back, and then we'll have a 50-year-old Brock Lesnar in the UFC. Meanwhile, like, the fifth Mike Perry will die in the octagon on the undercard of that bout, and the UFC will never learn their lesson. That does it for this episode of Heavy Hands. On a very depressing note, we end this one. Pat, before we go, what do you have coming out this week, man? I'm not sure I have anything coming out. I was going to try to write a thing for Deadspin, but I've got too much on my plate right now. I've got too many different projects going. Trying to finish my article on millennials and migration and education, which, Jesus, I've now been working on for a couple of months. It's about 5,000 words long. I did like 15 different interviews for this thing. So
It has turned out to be quite the project. I'm trying to finish that up. I have no idea when it'll come out, though. And then I'm working on 2 new episodes of Tides of History. And that's about it. What are you doing?
Things worth reading take time, Pat. So I trust that it'll come out in the end. As for me, well, Phil McKenzie, you may know him. He and I have we did one thing already that's up already for this week, and another thing will be coming out, I think. We did an episode of The Underdogs. We talked about Pat Healy, who just retired a few weeks ago. And not only Pat Healy, but the Pat Healy and his ilk, the category of fighters we chose to call foot slow gingers. And there were some good ones. Pat Healy, Jim Miller, Mark Bocek, Ed Herman. I mean, there's some winners in there. Red hair is a genetic defect, we learned over the course of this discussion. It makes you very slow, but it does not preclude you from being a very solid and interesting journeyman fighter. So our little tribute to Pat Healy can be found on the Heavy Hands Patreon for $3 patrons and above. $3 a month. That's not much, folks. And it was a good discussion. And then Phil and I are also working on a piece about the matchmaking of Mike Perry and fighters like him, and what the sort of, what the actual promotional logic is of the UFC in putting fights like Perry Griffin together, when many of us watching think they have something that deserves a little more care in their hands. So keep an eye out for that as well. Again, check out the Heavy Hands Patreon. And thank you for sitting through my diseased voice. Find us on social media if you have questions, concerns, or comments. You can find both Pat and I on Twitter. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman, and I am at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. You can also find us both on Facebook.com/either Patrick Wyman MMA. Do you like that voice crack, Pat?
I do. Love it.
Or // Connor Ruebusch MMA. Check out our work, Pat over on Deadspin. Check out Tides of History and my stuff on Bloody Elbow. And until next time, if you all came here for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands. I think that was pretty good.
Good shit, man.
This was our 200th episode, and we didn't even mention it. Should we...
Seriously?
Yeah. This is episode 200. I just realized as I went to save it. Should we add a little sting at the end where we say, so we can edit it in somewhere where we try to pretend like we knew what was happening?
Sure.
Hey.
So you want to...
It's... I don't know. What are we doing?
This is our 200th episode. That's crazy.
Yeah.
How have we recorded that many episodes? It feels like we have done both far more and far less than that.
Yeah, and what a momentous occasion to have to celebrate on our 200th episode, Pat. I mean...
Yana Kunitskaya?
Yeah.